Well, good evening, all those who might be tapping into this, our teachers. Welcome back to our workshop. I say teachers, but of course it's always open to anyone. I'm just going to go over to the wings and shut the door here. So hopefully you're aware at this point that we are transitioning over to the New Testament. We are starting in John, and this week sees us in John chapter 1, the first 18 verses. It occurred to me after doing the Sunday School Teachers Intensive this past Sunday, as I've tried to refine this was our 7th iteration of it, that I've tried to bring the material I teach through that much more in line with the specific lessons versus just the general themes that I had been doing when I first started that a year and a half ago. And so basically I have lessons built for every Sunday school lesson. And I thought I might as well just use this material that normally I only pull out once for that teacher intensive, and then I will personally revisit it. I don't know if any of the teachers are, but I can use it week to week in here since it actually ties in to a specific lesson. So I know it's kind of difficult if you're looking at the slides through your computer monitor. So I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit here and show you what I have. That way, hopefully, it'll clear it up for you a little bit. So I just want to make sure, though, as I have some time to go through this a little slower than I did this past Sunday, if you can make out the title of the slide, I asked the question, is John retelling the story of Torah through Jesus? Teaching the Gospels, of course, gets us excited as teachers. It should, for more reasons than I have time to go into. And of course, one of those reasons, when we start out with a gospel like John, chapter 1 is so theologically pregnant with truth, you could spend more than a month of Sundays going through just these 18 verses and dig new truth to the surface with every passing. And so 1 week, of course, I guess this could be said of most of our lessons and wherever we are in the Bible, is just not enough time to get everything that you want out. And so if you have already started your preparation for this lesson, it's possible you might have several good things that you have strung together that you feel confident in, and the prompting of the Spirit that this is what you need to share with your class, and nothing I share with you tonight or whenever you watch this may be a benefit, and that's totally okay. But part of why I do this is to just share with you some things that brighter minds than mine, and I do not claim to have a bright mind, have been able to piece together over their years, decades worth of culminating work and collaborating with other people as well, all standing on the tops of the shoulders of giants who've come before them to really pull things out that are sitting right there under the surface, but just most of us are not going to pick up on because we're not trained to read the Bible at that level. And so if I can point some of these things out for you, then maybe it might do something to help enrich your study. And then thereby, if you're mining out new truth because you're seeing it for the first time, you can pass this on to your students. So in asking the question, is John retelling the story of Torah, it of course indicates that perhaps if it's true, that what we're going to be looking at in the backdrop of these verses that John gives us is something of the entirety of the Torah, okay? And so part of the language you're going to hear me use, not just tonight, but in subsequent lessons through John, will be something like the Genesis portion of John or the Exodus portion of John. And I don't want that to confuse you. I can't assign certain chapters to that necessarily for you. But what I mean is if you take all 5 of Moses' books that the Torah consists of and all 21 chapters of John, and you wrote that as information, Torah and John, on 2 8 by 11.5 sheets of paper and put John over the Torah, in essence what you're getting is the entire length of John's story of Jesus' life spread out over the corpus and the progression of the story of the Torah, beginning with the creation of all things and ending with Israel just on the brink of going in to conquer the land, and with that to really tip over the next big domino in the sequence of what God has done in calling Israel out of Egypt. And of course that story backs all the way up to Abraham, one man, childless, that God gives a basket load of promises to. And Deuteronomy sees those promises on the precipice of just about to erupt in fulfillment once they enter the land, begin to conquer it, and then with that, of course, they're going to have an intergenerational mission of trying to impact the nations, Genesis 12:3, and all families of the earth will be blessed through you. And as they're doing that, working to somehow reconcile the nations back to God as being a kingdom of priests to the nations. All the gospel stories are kind of in line with this. And by gospel stories, I don't mean just the individual units in any given gospel. I mean Matthew's gospel, Mark's, Luke's, and I'll show you a little bit about how that works here in just a second. So to give you a few clues, because I think I could spend a lot of time going through all of them, and I won't make it through them all in the next 25 minutes, but just enough to kind of whet your appetite. And then, of course, if you're a teacher, you should be getting this information very soon, as Richard's going to email the presentation out if he hasn't done that already, and you can have this to peruse on your own to blow up and do what you want with or whatever. But just take the opening half of John's first verse of chapter 1 when he says, "In the beginning was the Word." And I know I'm certainly not the first one, or at least I wouldn't presume to be, to connect the link for you that John purposefully uses that phrase as a hyperlink to draw us back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, where, of course, it opens with, "In the beginning, God created." If we just stood alone right there without going through the rest of this and attempting to try to see if there are any other links, then there would be enough there to say, obviously, there is a deep and intimate connection in what John is attempting to try to force us to think through with respect to the idea that in the beginning, God, and of course in Genesis chapter 1, the prologue of all Scripture, we're seeing He creates everything that's going to be enumerated in chapter 1. But here we see a few doctrinal statements that are going to be marched out with respect to the work of the Trinity and Jesus' integral, very pivotal role with respect to His place. And of course it feeds into what is often called John's high Christology. It really ratchets up the understanding of who Jesus is in the spectrum of the Gospels in comparison to Matthew, Mark, and Luke versus anything that they might say. Most of what they'll say about Jesus is more or less implicative. John is just right in your face with this truth. I need to digress, though, in order to make it through the rest of these points, because John will go on to say in verse 5 of chapter 1, as he speaks more about who this person is that he is introducing to us, the Word, and the Word that was with God, the Word that was God, and then he immediately pivots to describing this personage, this entity, as light that shines in the darkness. But now hopefully I've got your wheels turning, because if we're looking at this juxtaposed against the Genesis backdrop, we start with Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, "And there was darkness upon the face of the deep. The earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Then in verse 3, what does God speak first into existence? Light. Let there be light. So in other words, John gives us these words, "In the beginning was the Word," and then within a few verses, he's immediately pivoting to light, as we see Moses doing when he gives us the opening account of how God created all things in Genesis chapter 1. That is not a mistake. John is building the ladder for us to take it one rung at a time and watch what he's doing. And eventually at some point in this, I'll help you see the purpose behind why he's doing that, so that when you ask the question, okay, this is great, but so what, we'll arrive at that. But we're not quite there yet. Moving on in John 1, we skip down to verse 12. He goes on to talk about those who will become disciples of Christ, and he says, "To those who did receive Him, He gave them the right to become children of God." Moving back over to the Genesis account, and what we see, while Genesis chapter 1 ends with this, we get a little bit more of an unpacking of this concept in chapter 2. Chapter 1, we see on the sixth day, God begins by creating animals. Then the climax of all creation comes at the end of that day when He creates the first and only creature that bears His image. And then, of course, we'll understand that on that same day, He'll take from that creature and make a duplicate, but yet somehow an inverted image of that, as goes the idea of another entity that shares the divine image of God, but yet is engendered in a completely different gender than the man is. And these two will become somehow strangely one flesh. And then that story advances forward in Genesis chapter 2 without the mentioning so much in chapter 1 of how God did what he did. In chapter 2, it becomes all too clear how God does what he does. And now there's a plurality of the one. By the one, I'm talking about the human. Where there was one, now there's two, but somehow joined together they become one. And when we speak of them, they are God's children because obviously they did not have birth parents. So backtracking this into John's gospel, he is speaking about how those who become the disciples of this one who is the light that shines in the darkness, that was with God, a transcendent, preeminent, pre-existent being in the beginning of all things, are now given the right to become what the original first pair of God's children lost or forfeited for all of us in the garden, restoring it in and through himself. So John is purposefully taking us back to the creation story. Now we could stop here and say that with just a few links that we've established so far, I think what we're clearly beginning to piece together is that this is seeing the creation account, but of course, John, as a Jewish man and a Jewish writer and a Jewish thinker, is going to be like all the rest of those who are part of his original audience. And that is, as Jewish readers and thinkers, they are automatically going to resort back to those particular stories, and they're going to, as much as we will, if not more so, anticipate what comes after Genesis chapters 1 and 2, meaning chapter 3 with the fall, 4, the rebellion of one brother against another, and ultimately God, and then the proliferation of sin that leads up to the flood, and of course the world ends in catastrophe to be reborn out of that in the story of Noah. But even that doesn't fix it. The rest of the biblical story is just one failure after another until we get to this moment. And this is that light shining in the darkness moment where now we have hope dawning for us. And the question becomes, as we've waded through the entirety of the Old Testament, what is God's solution going to be? He's broadcasted that very clearly in the mouths of the prophets. He's going to send one, a Davidic descendant. He is going to rule with righteousness. He's going to rule with justice. He is going to lead his people like a shepherd. He's going to build a temple. He's going to do all these fantastic things. They haven't happened yet. This story is to tell us how this all comes together. And what we're seeing here is the restoration of all things being painted in the picture of something like a new creation. So let's expound on that more. Because now we have the beginning, we have light, we have children of God. Of course, John isn't going systematically through each day of creation, but that's okay, because many of these other authors who have taken themes like this will telescope it down to give us the essential highlights of that new thing or that theme that they're recycling. John 1:14, the Word became flesh, and He dwelt. That word that's given to us in English comes from the Greek word that actually means tabernacled. So we're thinking the way that God, there with the children of the children of Israel at Sinai and Exodus, is telling them to fashion and create a tabernacle, a house for Him to dwell in and live with them in and meet with them in. But this story itself has its roots all the way back in the beginning of all things, because the tabernacle itself, with respect to the imagery that you find within it, all harkens back to the garden. The garden is more than just a place of botanical beauty. It's a place where God and man meet, which is essentially the foundational principle of tabernacle or temple. So the garden can very reasonably be argued as being a temple or, again, a tabernacle. So this keeps us in line with the progression of the Genesis story. In the beginning, then God creates light, piercing the darkness. Everything gets divided out into its nice, orderly components as God is dispelling chaos and creating a suitable habitat for human image bearers to live with Him, dwell with Him, and worship Him in. He corrals them up together in this one place He made uniquely, specially for them, and that's this garden paradise, of course, that is a temple where they come together to worship Him as they walk in wisdom with Him. And so now John is saying that God is choosing to tabernacle amongst men yet again. That is one of the great underlying themes of the Old Testament, that God has continuously attempted to try to do this over and again. But eventually what happens is the community who sees that come into fruition and reality are one of the more faithful communities And their children and progeny for several generations after that are just going to incrementally walk further away from that goal until God is disgusted with them and turns away from them, and even announces that through the prophets, and they seemingly don't care. They don't rectify their course of action and turn their hearts back to Him. Instead, they just keep marching toward the destruction and chaos laid out in front of them. The question now becomes, what will make this different? Well, now what makes this different is God has become a man Himself. That's what John is clearly putting on the paper for us to see, is that God is becoming a man, and God is interjecting Himself into human history for the sake of seizing this objective, making it His own now, and not using others for the sake of it any longer. We go to verse 11, which causes us to backtrack just a bit, but nonetheless, it will keep us on pace. He came to His own did not receive Him. Is this not what happens in the rebellion of the garden? I mean, the ones that God made in the garden are exactly made for that purpose, that they would choose God. They would willingly love Him. They were not made to be automatons or robots who just have to obligingly obey without any form of conscience to choose what is right, what is wrong, what is best, what is not best. They rebel against God, and the same thing John is telling us is ultimately going to happen as this story will progress. Jesus came first to the lost sheep of Israel, and it is resoundingly that community who, while there are many who will follow Him, the majority of them will be the ones who are crying out, "Crucify," in front of Pilate's halls by the end of the Passion Week. And I have several more to go through, but I just want to give you a couple of more from John chapter 1. But these verses, of course, go beyond verse 18. So teachers, I would say, even though we stop at verse 18, next week when we pick up, we're going to actually be in the bottom half of this chapter, and this will prepare you for that just a little bit, but I don't want to steal too much thunder. Some of these verses aren't going to be part of the ones we cover. So John, that being the actual apostle and author of the gospel, is now recording his version of John the Baptizer's meeting with Jesus in the Jordan, gives it to us from a slightly different perspective. Instead of actually talking about Jesus going into the water, this is the aftermath of what happens when Jesus comes out, which is common to all the Gospels. But John also tells us that John the Baptizer was preempted by God with an understanding that the one who he saw coming up out of the water, well, actually, the one who he saw the Spirit of God descending in the form of a dove upon would be the one who he was preparing everyone for. And this unexpectedly happens at the moment when his cousin comes seeking baptism of him. So the Spirit of God descends like a dove. Again, keeping in pace with the Genesis story, Genesis chapter 9, of course, that fast forwards way beyond chapter 3 where I left you off at a second ago, but there's not much material between 3 and 9. It's just the proliferation of sin through Cain's line, the arising of Seth to replace Abel, and then how those two lineages interfaced with each other, the giving rise unto Noah, who is going to be the rest bringer, and then chapter 6 actually begins the flood narrative. Chapter 9 is just simply how the whole story itself ends. And it ends with Noah recognizing that the flood is going to come to an end soon. The waters are receding. He's testing to see whether or not the earth is now habitable for humans to disembark the ark yet, even though it hasn't quite rested. He's sent out birds. They come back. Now he's sent out a dove. The dove comes back with the olive branch, and then after that, the dove departs. And with that, we have a clear sign that God has remembered them and has made safe haven for them to very soon disembark the ark. And again, the ark is kind of like the Garden of Eden itself. It's got man, it's got all creation in it, or at least representatives of it, and they're being spilled out into a completely revamped earth, washed clean of all the sinfulness and wickedness of Cain's line and the vestiges of what was left for those in Seth's line that didn't want to follow the Lord as Noah was doing. And with that, the dove becomes a harbinger of new creation, of God remembering the suffering of His people and choosing by His grace to redeem them in spite of the fact they are not worthy of it. And so, of all the things that the Holy Spirit could have turned Himself into or presented Himself as, why a dove? This is clearly the reason why, because it harkens back to those stories so very clearly to show us that in the mixture of it all, here you've got Jesus coming up out of the water, and as the waters are being torn apart, so is the heavens above being torn apart, the waters above and the waters below. It's the very story of creation itself as waters being torn apart and divided into their separate spaces and realms, but here all acting together as the voice from above is spoken into the ears of those below for everyone to recognize this is the Davidic descendant from Psalm 2, my beloved Son, and the servant of Isaiah 42, in whom I'm well pleased. And the Spirit of God inaugurating him as the bearer of both of those titles and mantles of responsibility, and with that signaling a new creation. So we could just go much further off the deep end with this, but I think I've given you enough to kind of whet your appetite, and I want to give you another slide that's got some more information on there for you. Now, if you're noticing this, because I've covered this, I just haven't told you directly that's what I was doing. In these green boxes, I'm trying to help you understand that the story of Israel is that of basically a new Adam. Quick 30-second overview. Let me help you see that. Because you think of Adam in Genesis 2, he is formed outside the garden, and the garden's the special place God has made to put him in so that he walks with God in the garden, worships God in the garden. Abraham was called outside of the land that God is going to plant him in. He's taken from the wreckage of Babel, and he's going to go to a new land. And later on, to his descendants in the book of Exodus is described as a land flowing with milk and honey. It's pictured like a new Eden space that they are going to fill, kind of like a vine planted that's going to fill up the trellis of that empty space once all the Canaanites are gone. And they are going to populate the earth and bring with it the fruit and blessing of what's supposed to happen when they walk faithfully with God and help others in the process being reconciled to do so. So this is just points in their story that march right along with the points from John and the Genesis backdrop to show you that it's just a recapitulation of the creation story, but now with Israel as a body is like a new corporate Adam. I would love to make that make more sense, but for the meantime, I don't have the time for it because I want to keep going with this. Just to show you, John is not the only one who takes the inspiration from Torah itself to be the rubric or basically the fencing by which he is going to, or that gospel writer is going to map out their story. If you think about it, Mark, the very first gospel we have record of being written to preserve the account of Jesus, if you count the day and evening markers throughout the gospel itself, there are 7 of them, and that's not a coincidence. To say that there are 7 day-evening matches, and in every one of those you don't have the mention of day. More often than not, it's evening, but of course evening signifies that right on its heels comes, and we have in Genesis chapter 1, when the end of the first day, when God created light, was over before the next day comes, we are told it was evening and morning, and that was day 1. And that same formula for all 5 days that follow it till we get to day 7. So it seems very conspicuous that Mark, in the 3 years he's giving us, it's really 18 months, but it represents 3 years of Jesus' life and ministry before he leaves and goes back to heaven, that he sums all of this up by giving us just brief mentions of 7 days. And it just so happens that the 7th and final day happens to be the very morning when Jesus is erupting up out of the grave. Matthew is probably way more prolific than Mark is because he seems to take the life of Jesus, and there is so much more to it than this. It's not just Moses. There are many other Old Testament biblical characters that Matthew seemingly maps on to the ministry of Jesus as he's telling his whole story from beginning to end, starting with the birth, which Mark didn't. But here's a few points of parallel here that you could go through to clearly see that he's attempting to try to show that Jesus is a more superior Moses, a more superior Joshua, a more superior Samuel, a more superior David and Solomon, a more superior Elijah and Elisha, and many other characters that he weaves into the story. So to say that they're taking inspiration from Old Testament stories and creating them or using them to create their gospel as the backdrop is hugely pivotal because it changes the way that we start to see those stories. It forces us to take some giant steps back and see those stories in a reimagined way, and ultimately helps us appreciate the fact that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of those stories, which, like, no-brainer, I've got that. That's not hard to see. But more importantly, what I would point to with that is that it forces us to recognize the whole point by which I'm trying to strive at, getting you to see John using the Torah as his backdrop. And that is, Jesus is redeeming the broken legacy of Israel as a nation. This is all the more reason why it's important for us to know our Isaiah and know our Isaiah very well. And I understand Isaiah is a daunting book to read. It's easy to get lost and confused when you're going through it. One of the biggest ones in the Old Testament, right? But nonetheless, if there was at least one piece that I would encourage you to get familiar with, which is deeply rooted in what comes before it, but chapters 40 through 66 are probably the pieces of Isaiah that we need to know like the back of our hand, because so many prophecies come directly from that relate to the gospel. It is essentially the gospel in the Old Testament. Because in Isaiah 42, then we leapfrog to 49 through 55, we have the story of the servant. And that character being introduced to us is helping us understand, as that person is being called the Israel, that they are taking the story and mantle of Israel to this point, which is a horribly broken past, and they are redeeming that. They are buying it back, essentially, from the clutches of defeat and turning it into a story of victory. But it is God's victory, and of course the fact that, as we'll see in Isaiah, a little bit more dimly veiled, but here in John, on full display for the world to see, that God is the one who interjects himself into human history by becoming a human being to redeem the broken history of Israel and then make Israel a faithful people, ultimately in the end, by creating from them a new Israel from the remnants of the old, the faithful Israel. And that faithful Israel are the ones who hear Jesus' message and will come alongside him and choose to trust that he is Messiah, the one they were waiting on this entire time, versus all of the others who are part of ethnic Israel because they descend from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they soundly reject Jesus as Messiah. I got a couple minutes here. Let me just give you another thing that we're going to get to in coming weeks, but because I don't have much time to unpack it now, that gives me more time to unpack it later. But again, just to kind of whet your appetite. Starting in John chapter 2, we have on the third day a wedding feast going on in Cana of Galilee. So I'll mention this again when we get to this in a week or two. But in John chapter 1, count it up, we have 4 days that pass from the beginning of John's gospel, which we don't really count the first about 14 verses of this because that's more or less prologue. After that, when we actually get into the historical narrative of Jesus' journey in John, that we count up 4 days that pass. Then, when we get into John chapter 2, we are told on the third day, meaning at the end of 4 days, 3 days pass by again. So 4 plus 3 gives us 7, which John, if you're not familiar, in his gospel and in the book of Revelation, loves to use this number so many times because he will in so many different ways. And of course, not only does he love the patterns that go along with it that are there for our discovery, but he even loves the use of the word sign, because he's the only gospel writer that uses it as prolifically as he does. And of course, it's all throughout the book of Revelation as well. That being said, think about it this way. In the Genesis narrative, at the end of the 7 days of creation, 6th day ends with the man and the woman being created. Then they enter into the 7th day, God's perpetual Sabbath rest. And in Genesis chapter 2, whereas we are not informed of this in Genesis chapter 1, the man and the woman are brought together purposefully. And this is mentioned after the beginning of the 7th day. They are purposefully brought together to become one flesh. And the statement is proclaimed that from henceforth shall a man leave his father and his mother, cleave unto his wife, and the two shall become one. So after the 7th day, part of God's perpetual Sabbath rest that he brings man into to rest with him in sacred space, we see the inauguration of a wedding. If John chapter 1 is taking inspiration from the Torah and primarily the creation account itself, and it's showing us that in this beginning, God is speaking light into existence, and that light is him tabernacling amongst humanity himself to dispel the darkness and to invite humanity to become his children and truly have the right to be called his children now. He is instigating a new creation, if you will. Then what is really going on here is that he is symbolizing through John's mention, and John being the only one who mentions this wedding feast, that he is inviting humanity into the intimacy of relationship with him that can only be characterized and described as a marriage. And There are so many verses in the Old Testament that show this is how God accorded his relationship with Israel. I'll just give you one. Isaiah 54, verse 5. Indeed, your husband is your maker. His name is the Lord of armies. So that's what we're going to be jumping into. I just wanted to give you that as a preview to kind of help you see that this trend is going to supersede chapter 1 and go into chapter 2 as well. So with that, we are out of time. Any concluding thoughts or questions? Well, if not, I appreciate your time.